If you grew up in Thunder Bay, you grew up knowing what Canadian Car and Foundry meant. The paychecks that kept the North End alive, the gate that swallowed 1,000 workers every morning, the factory that built fighter planes one decade and subway cars the next. At its peak, CanCar employed 7,000 workers on a site that stretched along the Kaministiquia River like a small city. They survived 16 years of dormancy when deer colonized the grounds, survived the Arrow cancellation, survived 5 ownership changes, and every contraction the century could deliver. And then, after more than 100 years of building at the lakehead, the workforce that once numbered 7,000 was thinned to 240. How does a factory survive everything and still end up a fraction of itself? What happened? Chapter 1. The River and the Rails. The Kaministiquia River empties into Lake Superior at the western edge of Ontario, where the boreal forest runs unbroken to the horizon, and winter arrives in October and doesn't leave until May. The city that grew up at the river's mouth, Fort William, later merged with Port Arthur to become Thunder Bay, sits closer to Winnipeg than to Toronto, closer to Duluth than to Ottawa. It's a place defined by distance, from markets, from head offices, from the political centers where decisions about its future would always, eventually, be made. In 1912, when a crew of laborers broke ground on a sprawling new industrial complex along the south bank of the Kaministiquia, Fort William was a boomtown. The Canadian Pacific Railway had been running through it for nearly 30 years. 2 more transcontinental lines, the Canadian Northern and the Grand Trunk Pacific, were being hammered into existence across the Shield, and every mile of track required rolling stock. Boxcars, flat cars, gondolas, coal hoppers, passenger coaches. The demand seemed limitless. The grain elevators rising along the harbor were already the largest in the world, funneling prairie wheat onto lake freighters, bound for the St. Lawrence and the Atlantic beyond. Finnish immigrants had been arriving in waves since the 1880s, building a community that would become the largest Finnish settlement outside Finland. 15,000 people and their descendants, concentrated in neighborhoods where the language on the street was as likely to be Finnish as English. Ukrainian families, Italian stonemasons, workers from across Northern and Eastern Europe had followed, drawn by the same crude promise. There was work at the lakehead, hard work, but steady. The plant they were building belonged to a company called Canadian Car and Foundry. The name was only 3 years old, but the ambitions behind it were enormous. CC&F had been engineered into existence as a national monopoly, a single corporation designed to capture virtually the entire Canadian market for railway rolling stock at the precise moment when that market was exploding. The men who had arranged the merger were sitting in offices in Montreal and London. The men who would build the boxcars, pour the castings, and rivet the steel were standing on the frozen banks of the Kaministiquia, watching the foundations go in. The story of Canadian Car and Foundry is the story of that distance, between the people who did the work and the people who owned it, between a Northern Ontario factory floor and a succession of boardrooms in Montreal, London, Mississauga, Paris, and the glass towers of the Caisse de Dépôt. Over more than a century, the plant on the Kaministiquia would build boxcars and minesweepers, fighter planes and buses, logging machines and subway trains. It would employ 7,000 people during one war and 300 during one recession. It would be owned by 6 different corporate entities across 5 countries, and not one of them, not one, would be headquartered in Thunder Bay. It begins with a 30-year-old financial promoter from New Brunswick and a 58-year-old carpenter from Nova Scotia. They had almost nothing in common except timing. Chapter 2. The Carpenter and the Promoter. Nathaniel Curry was born in 1851 in Hopewell Cape, New Brunswick, a shipbuilding village on the Petitcodiac River where the Bay of Fundy tides ran so high they reversed the current twice a day. His father was a farmer. Young Curry apprenticed as a carpenter, the universal skilled trade of the maritime provinces, where wood was the material of everything: houses, ships, wharves, churches, and increasingly, railway cars. He was good with his hands, restless with his ambition, and by his early 20s, he'd left the Maritimes entirely for the American West, working the Virginia and Truckee Railroad in Nevada, a short-line railway that ran between Carson City and Virginia City, serving the Comstock Lode silver mines. It was a rough education in a rough country. Curry learned how American railways built and maintained rolling stock, how a car shop operated, what tolerances mattered, and which corners could be cut. When he came home to Nova Scotia, he brought that knowledge with him. In 1877, Curry joined Nelson Admiral Rhodes and a third partner named Bayard Dodge in founding Rhodes, Curry and Company in the town of Amherst, Nova Scotia. Dodge left early. Rhodes and Curry stayed. What they built over the next 3 decades was the largest railway car manufacturer in the maritime provinces. A sprawling complex of woodworking shops, paint sheds, and assembly bays that turned out passenger coaches, freight cars, and snowplows for railways across eastern Canada. When the Harris Car Works of St. John, New Brunswick, came up for sale in 1893, Rhodes Curry bought it and absorbed its order book. By the turn of the century, their Amherst works alone could produce 4,000 freight cars and 60 passenger cars a year. In a region where most industry was small-scale and seasonal, fishing, lumbering, farming, Rhodes Curry was a genuine industrial anchor. Curry became mayor of Amherst 3 times beginning in 1894. He endowed the chair of engineering at Acadia University in 1911. He was a pillar, the word that always gets used for men like him in small maritime towns, and for once, it's accurate. He built something real with his hands before he built it with his capital. He employed hundreds of people in a town of 8,000. He knew their names. He walked the same streets. But the world Curry had built in Amherst was about to be absorbed by a world he hadn't anticipated. The world of high finance, stock promotion, and industrial consolidation that was sweeping through Edwardian Canada like a fever. The man carrying that fever was William Maxwell Aitken. Aitken was born in 1879 in Maple, Ontario, and raised in Newcastle, New Brunswick. A manse kid, the son of a Presbyterian minister. He was short, sharp-featured, ferociously ambitious, and possessed of a gift for financial engineering that made him a millionaire before his 30th birthday. Operating through the Royal Securities Corporation, a Halifax, Montreal, London investment firm he'd taken control of in his 20s, Aitken had discovered the basic mechanism of the Edwardian industrial merger. Buy several small companies in the same sector, combine them into one large company, issue shares at a valuation higher than the sum of the parts, and pocket the difference. The technical term was stock watering. The practical effect was enormous personal wealth extracted from the gap between a company's book value and its promoted market capitalization. Between 1909 and 1910, Aitken executed 3 of these mergers in rapid succession. Canada Cement combined 11 cement producers into one. The Steel Company of Canada, Stelco, merged 5 Hamilton area steelmakers. And on the 29th of October 1909, Canadian Car and Foundry was incorporated in Montreal, fusing Curry's Rhodes, Curry and Company with 2 central Canadian competitors. The Canada Car Company of Turcot, Quebec, incorporated in January 1905 with W.P. Coleman as president and Sir Hugh Allen as vice president, and the Dominion Car and Foundry Company of Montreal. The commercial logic was straightforward. 3 transcontinental railways were under construction simultaneously. The CPR was already running. The Canadian Northern was being built by Mackenzie and Mann, and the Grand Trunk Pacific and National Transcontinental were being pushed across the Shield and the prairies by the Laurier government. Every one of them needed rolling stock. The national policy tariff regime, the protective wall that had shielded Canadian manufacturing since 1879, ensured that the cars would be built in Canada, not imported from the United States. The demand was real. The protection was real. What Aitken added was scale, and the stock watering that made the deal profitable for the promoters, regardless of what happened to the factories. Nathaniel Curry was installed as the first president of Canadian Car and Foundry. It was a ceremonial appointment, the old maritime industrialist lending his credibility and his gray hair to a deal engineered by a man half his age. Combined assets exceeded $2.2 million. The merger's annual capacity was staggering. Thousands of freight cars, hundreds of passenger coaches, enough steel castings to feed the appetite of 3 transcontinental railways building simultaneously across the second-largest country on Earth. Currie moved his family permanently from Amherst to Montreal in 1910. He was named to the Canadian Senate in 1912. He died at Tidnish, Nova Scotia, on the 23rd of October 1931, long after the company that bore his industry's name had moved beyond anything he'd built in Amherst. The old Amherst plant, the original Rhodes Currie Works, closed for good that same year. Aitken, meanwhile, had already left Canada. By 1910, the scrutiny around his merger deals, Sir Sanford Fleming, the railway engineer and inventor of Standard Time, publicly accused him of fraud over the Canada cement transaction, had made staying uncomfortable. He sailed for England, bought a seat in Parliament, and began the reinvention that would make him Lord Beaverbrook, press baron, wartime cabinet minister, and one of the most powerful men in the British Empire. The historian Gregory Marchildon, in his study of the Aitken mergers, concluded that Aitken's 3 industrial creations performed better than the typical industrial merger created during the Laurier boom. That's a generous reading. What's inarguable is that Aitken created the corporate shell that would house more than a century of industrial life at the lakehead, and that he did it primarily for the profit on the stock. The deeper irony wouldn't become clear for another 3 decades. When Britain needed hurricanes in 1940, the Minister of Aircraft Production, who championed their manufacture at the Fort William plant, was Lord Beaverbrook, the same Max Aitken who had financially fathered the company 30 years earlier. The carpenter's firm, the promoter's deal, and the politician's wartime urgency would converge on a factory floor beside the Kaministiquia River. But that convergence was still a generation away. First, the plant had to be built, and then it had to survive something worse than war. Silence. Chapter 3. 12 Ships and a Long Silence. The Fort William plant was supposed to be finished by July 1913. The site was enormous, a flat stretch of land on the south bank of the Kaministiquia, on the traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation, served by rail spurs and accessible to Great Lakes shipping. The plan was to build a complete rolling stock manufacturing complex, assembly bays with barrel-roofed halls running parallel to the river, machine shops, a foundry, paint shops, rail-served loading docks, and enough floor space to produce boxcars, flat cars, and passenger coaches for all 3 transcontinental railways simultaneously. The workforce would be drawn from the immigrant communities already concentrated at the lakehead: the Finns, the Ukrainians, the Italians, the workers from half a dozen countries who'd come to northwestern Ontario because there was steel to pour, and wood to cut, and rail to lay. The plant stayed unfinished for 3 more years. Construction dragged through 1914 and into the war years, slowed by labor shortages, material diversions, and the sudden reordering of priorities that came with August 1914. The first major delivery was promising enough: 3,000 Fowler-pattern outside-braced wooden boxcars for the CPR, shipped in 1914. But the railway boom that had justified the merger was already deflating. The Canadian Northern and the Grand Trunk Pacific were both sliding toward insolvency. The order book thinned. The plant that had been built to feed 3 transcontinental railways found itself struggling to feed one. What saved Fort William from immediate closure was the war, but not in the way anyone had expected. CCNF's Montreal operations won a contract to assemble artillery shells at a facility in Kingsland, New Jersey. On the 11th of January, 1917, that plant exploded in a massive fire, widely attributed to German sabotage, part of the same Black Tom network that had detonated an ammunition depot on the New Jersey waterfront 6 months earlier. The Kingsland fire was spectacular, but, remarkably, non-fatal. It didn't end CCNF's war work. What it did was remind everyone involved that manufacturing for a wartime government carried risks that peacetime railcar production did not. The Fort William plant's own war contract was more unusual. The Canadian government, looking for work to keep the Lakehead facility alive, arranged for CCNF to build 12 Navarin-class wooden minesweepers for the French Navy. These were substantial vessels, wooden-hulled, steam-powered, designed to sweep the mines that German submarines had seeded across the shipping lanes of the Atlantic. Building warships on the shore of Lake Superior, 800 kilometers from the nearest saltwater, was an exercise in improvisation and determination. The shipwrights who assembled those hulls were working in a plant designed for boxcars, using skills adapted from railcar construction to naval standards. All 12 were launched from the Kamenistikia in 1918. 2 of them never reached the ocean. On the 24th of November, 1918, 13 days after the armistice, the minesweepers Inkerman and Sarasols departed Fort William on their maiden voyage, heading east across Lake Superior toward the Sulaks and eventually the Atlantic. They sailed into a late November gale. Both ships vanished. All 78 crew members, French and Canadian sailors, were lost. No wreckage was ever conclusively identified. No bodies were recovered. The Fort William Daily Times Journal ran the story for days. The disappearance, the search, the conspiracy theories. German sabotage was whispered. But the likeliest explanation was the simplest and the most terrible. Lake Superior in November had killed before, and the wooden-hulled minesweepers, designed for coastal waters, were no match for open lake seas driven by a northwestern gale. It remains the worst single loss of life in the history of Lake Superior. The other 10 minesweepers arrived too late to see military service. They passed into civilian trade and scattered. The war was over. The railway boom was over. And the Fort William plant, barely operational, was about to go dark. The post-war contraction was swift and brutal. Mayor Harry Murphy of Fort William sent a personal plea to Ottawa on the 22nd of January, 1919. A letter begging for federal contracts, for anything that would keep the plant running and the workers employed. Ottawa's answer was silence. CCNF's Montreal management, now led by W. W. Butler, Wilson Workman Butler, who had succeeded Currie as president on the 30th of January 1919, had larger problems. The company's order book had collapsed with the railway boom. A late flicker of business came from an unexpected source. The Russian Soviet Republic ordered 500 bogie tank cars from CCNF Montreal at the end of 1921, a contract that sustained the Montreal operations but did nothing for Fort William. By 1921, the Thunder Bay plant was dormant, not closed, not officially. A skeleton crew of about a dozen men stayed on to maintain the buildings, oil the machinery, and keep the roofs from collapsing under the weight of northern Ontario snow. The assembly bays stood empty. The rail spurs rusted. And according to the local accounts preserved in Gordon Burkowski's Can Car, A History, the indispensable company history published by Bombardier in 1995, a herd of deer moved onto the grounds. They grazed the overgrown yards for years, undisturbed by the machinery that had never properly started and the workforce that had never properly arrived. The silence lasted 16 years. W. W. Butler ran CCNF through the entirety of the dormancy, from 1919 until his death on the 18th of June, 1937. Victor Montague Drury succeeded him as president on the 1st of September, 1937. By then, the Depression had bottomed out, and something was stirring, not in Canada's domestic economy, which remained sluggish, but across the Atlantic, where a British government was beginning to understand that it did not have enough fighter planes to survive what was coming. The plant on the Kamenistikia had been silent for 16 years. The deer had the run of the place. And then, in the spring of 1938, a British air mission arrived in Canada, and everything changed. Chapter 4: Queen of the Hurricanes. The British air mission that toured Canadian industrial facilities in May 1938 was shopping for manufacturing capacity, specifically for plants that could build military aircraft under license for the Royal Air Force. Britain's own factories were running flat out and falling behind. The shadow of the Luftwaffe was lengthening across Europe, and the arithmetic was simple. More planes were needed than Britain alone could produce. The Dominion countries, Canada, Australia, South Africa, were the obvious overflow. Fort William had a champion. C.D. Howe, the Member of Parliament for Port Arthur, Fort William's twin city, was also the federal Minister of Transport, and he was about to become the most powerful economic figure in wartime Canada. Howe personally ensured that the British mission inspected the Can Car plant at the Lakehead. What the mission found was a sleeping giant. a sprawling complex of assembly bays, machine shops, and foundry space that had been built for heavy manufacturing, maintained for 16 years by a skeleton crew, and never used at anything close to capacity. The floor space was enormous. The rail connections were intact. The workforce, the Finnish and Ukrainian and Italian communities of the Lakehead, was there, unemployed and available. What the plant lacked was anyone who knew how to build an aeroplane. That problem was solved by the most remarkable individual in this story. Elizabeth Muriel Gregory McGill was born in Vancouver on the 27th of March, 1905. Her mother, Helen Gregory McGill, was a judge, a suffragist, and one of the first women in British Columbia to hold judicial office. Elsie, the name she used all her life, inherited her mother's intelligence and her mother's refusal to accept the boundaries that the world drew around women. She enrolled in electrical engineering at the University of Toronto, graduating in 1927 as the first woman to earn that degree from the institution. She then moved to the University of Michigan, where in 1929 she became the first woman in the world to earn a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. Then polio struck. McGill contracted the disease during her studies and spent months in recovery. She would walk with 2 metal canes for the rest of her life. The disability was severe enough to end most careers. McGill treated it as an obstacle to be engineered around, not a verdict to be accepted. She continued working in aviation, and in 1938, at the age of 33, she was hired as Chief Aeronautical Engineer at Canadian Car and Foundry's Fort William plant, the first woman in the world to hold such a position at any aircraft manufacturer. Her first task was modest. She designed the Maple Leaf Trainer II, a training aircraft that became the first airplane in the world designed by a woman. Her second task was not modest at all. In November 1938, CCNF received a contract from the British government to build 40 Hawker Hurricane fighters under license at the Fort William plant. The Hurricane was the RAF's frontline fighter, the workhorse that would, 2 years later, account for more kills than the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. Building it in a railcar factory on the shore of Lake Superior, with a workforce that had never seen an aircraft assembly line, was an act of either extraordinary ambition or extraordinary desperation. It was probably both. McGill took on the engineering challenge with a precision that her contemporaries found staggering. The Hurricane was designed and built in Britain using British manufacturing methods, hand-fitted components, skilled trade assembly techniques that assumed a deep pool of experienced aircraft workers. Fort William had none of that. What it had was a railway car workforce accustomed to heavy metal fabrication, and a chief engineer who understood that the only way to build Hurricanes at volume in Northern Ontario was to redesign the manufacturing process from scratch. She broke the aircraft down into 25,000 interchangeable precision parts. She designed jigs, fixtures, and tooling that allowed semi-skilled workers, many of them recruited from the railcar trades, many of them women who had never held a rivet gun, to assemble fighters to RAF specification on a production line that owed more to the automobile industry than to the British aircraft tradition. She personally engineered the winterized variants that would operate in Canadian conditions: ski-equipped landing gear, rubberized electrothermal de-icing strips that kept the control surfaces from freezing at altitude. The Sea Hurricane modifications that allowed carrier operations were her work. Her 1940 engineering paper, Factors Affecting Mass Production of Aeroplanes, published in the Engineering Journal, laid out the manufacturing philosophy in technical detail. The first Canadian-built Hurricane, a Mark I bearing serial number P5170, made its maiden flight on the 10th of January 1940, lifting off from Bishop's Field, a grass airstrip 3 miles from the main factory. The name honored Billy Bishop, the Victoria Cross recipient and Canada's most famous First World War fighter ace. Test pilots flew the completed aircraft from Bishop's Field against the backdrop of Mount McKay, the flat-topped mesa that dominates the Thunder Bay skyline, a sacred site to the Fort William First Nation, now watching Hurricanes climb past its summit. Between the first flight in January 1940 and the last Hurricane, Mark the 13th, serial PZ865, rolling off the line in June 1943, Cancar Fort William produced 1,451 Hurricanes, Marks the 1, X, Inxine, and the Thene, Roughly 10% of the world's total hurricane production of 14,487 aircraft came from a railcar plant in northern Ontario. At peak production, the line was turning out 20 aircraft per week, fast enough to replace the entire RAF's Battle of Britain losses twice over. Monthly output reached approximately 100 aircraft. The scale of it was extraordinary. A plant that had been home to deer 3 years earlier was now one of the largest aircraft factories in the British Empire. McGill scaled the workforce from 500 to 4,500 in under 2 years. The True Comics cover of January 1942, a real American comic book that ran educational stories, carried her portrait with the headline, "Meet Elsie McGill, Chief Engineer of Canada's Great Hurricane Fighter Factory." You will learn why a crippled girl bosses one of the biggest warplane plants in all the British Empire. And you'll like this girl. The language was of its time. The achievement was timeless. The press called her the Queen of the Hurricanes, and the name stuck. Behind the headlines, there was a logistical reality that the propaganda didn't mention. About 80% of the Hurricanes built at Fort William shipped to Britain without engines. The Rolls-Royce Merlin, the 12-cylinder supercharged engine that powered the Hurricane and the Spitfire, was in such desperate short supply that the completed airframes crossed the Atlantic as gliders, waiting for power plants that were being produced slower than the aircraft that needed them. The RCF, trying to equip its own squadrons in 1941, resorted to cannibalizing Merlin III engines from obsolete ferry battles to put 30 Hurricane Mark Y's into Canadian service. It was a measure of how fast McGill's production line was running that the engine makers couldn't keep pace. Lord Beaverbrook, Max Aitken, the man who had merged the company into existence in 1909, was now Churchill's Minister of Aircraft Production. He was the single most powerful voice in Britain demanding more fighters, faster. The irony was clean and unavoidable. The promoter who had created CCNF as a stock-watering exercise 3 decades earlier was now depending on the same company to produce the aircraft that would defend the country he'd adopted. Beaverbrook's political backing, combined with Howe's domestic authority, ensured that the Fort William plant received priority allocation of materials, labor, and government funding. The Hurricane line at Cancar was a joint production of Canadian engineering, British urgency, and 2 men's overlapping legacies. McGill ran the engineering side. The works manager was E.J. Bill Soulsby, a veteran manufacturing executive who handled the production floor while McGill handled the blueprints. Together, they turned a mothballed railcar plant into the largest single aircraft manufacturing facility in Canada during the Second World War. Together, they also fell in love, and that would cost them both. Chapter 5. The Rosies and the Reckoning. The workforce that built Hurricanes and Helldivers at Fort William was one of the most remarkable industrial communities ever assembled in Canada. At peak wartime production, the plant employed somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 workers. The exact number depends on the source. The National Film Board's 1999 documentary Rosies of the North, directed by Kelly Saxberg, uses the figure of 7,000. The City of Thunder Bay's official history says more than 5,000. Bombardier's later site managers cited 5,000. The variation likely reflects different counting methods. Peak shift rotation totals across the Hurricane and Helldiver eras combined probably touched 7,000. Point-in-time employment on any given day ran closer to 4,500 to 5,000. Either way, the plant was the single largest employer in northwestern Ontario by a factor of 10. Women made up 10% of the workforce in 1941. By 1944, that proportion had risen to roughly 40%, about 3,000 women on the shop floor. Many of them recruited from the prairies with promises of steady wages that outstripped anything available in retail or domestic service. They came from Saskatchewan wheat farms and Manitoba small towns, from families where the men had gone overseas and the women had been left to figure out how to live. Cancar offered them something that the rest of wartime Canada mostly didn't: industrial wages for industrial work. They riveted, they welded, they drilled. They worked the electrical department and the fabric shop and the assembly line. They worked shifts that ran until 3 o'clock in the morning and came back for the next shift the same day. Their names survive because of a remarkable act of corporate generosity 3 decades after the war ended. In 1999, Bombardier, which by then owned the Thunder Bay plant, donated hundreds of wartime photographs and employee records to the Friends of the Finnish Labor Temple, a community heritage organization. Those records became the foundation of the Rosies of the North Archive, a collection of images, oral histories, and personnel files that documented what it was like to work as a woman in a wartime aircraft factory in northern Ontario. Rhoda McKay started in the assembly line. "It was riveting and drilling holes and stuff like that," she said later, with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who didn't consider what she'd done to be extraordinary. Margaret Gandier said the experience certainly matured us. Margaret Cook, née Nixon, worked in the electrical department, riveting wiring harnesses into fuselage sections. Ella Byrne worked the line. Stella Dutkiewicz's name appears in the records without elaboration, but her presence is documented. She was there. She built aircraft. She was part of it. Nina Godecki was fired on her wedding day. Cancar, like many wartime manufacturers, enforced a no married women policy. The logic was administrative and patriarchal in equal measure. Married women, the thinking went, would become pregnant and leave, wasting the training investment. Nina Godecki married fellow Cancar worker Tony Godecki in 1943. She was dismissed the same day. The policy was enforced selectively and unevenly. Some married women stayed, some were pushed out. But Nina's case was remembered because of its brazenness. She'd been building aircraft one shift and was escorted out the next, for the offense of marrying a man who worked beside her. The shop floor culture was rough. Men and women worked side by side in an environment that had never been designed for mixed-gender labor, and the frictions were real. One incident passed into Cancar legend. A male worker, whose abuse of the women on his section had become intolerable, woke up from lunch one day to find that the women had welded his lunch pail to a steel plate. He couldn't lift it. He couldn't pry it free. The point was made with an acetylene torch, which is about as direct as workplace communication gets. Daily life in the plant was physically punishing. The assembly bays were vast, drafty spaces, warm enough near the welding stations and rivet lines, bitterly cold near the loading docks where Lake Superior's winter pushed through every gap in the corrugated walls. The noise was constant. Pneumatic rivet guns, drill presses, the whine of machine tools shaping aluminum and steel, the rumble of completed fuselage sections being moved on overhead cranes. The air smelled of machine oil, hot metal, and the particular chemical sharpness of aircraft dope. The cellulose solution used to seal and tighten the fabric covering on the Hurricane's wings and control surfaces. Workers close to the doping stations described headaches and nausea that nobody measured and nobody reported. In 1943, the Hurricane line ended and the plant retooled for the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, a carrier-based dive bomber built under license for the United States Navy, designated SBW-1, SBW-3, SBW-4E, and SBW-5 in Canadian production. The Helldiver was a notoriously difficult aircraft. The U.S. Navy issued approximately 53,000 specification changes during its production run, a staggering number that reflected both the aircraft's design problems and the Navy's insistence on continuous modification. The retooling from Hurricane to Helldiver was an engineering nightmare, and it was during this transition that the blow fell. In 1943, Elsie McGill and Bill Soulsby were both dismissed from Canadian Car and Foundry. The official explanation cited production delays on the Helldiver transition. Delays that were real, driven by those tens of thousands of specification changes, and that were bedeviling every Helldiver manufacturer, not just Cancar. The actual reason was an open secret. McGill and Soulsby had been conducting an affair, and the company's management used the production delays as cover for removing them both. They married within weeks of their dismissal, moved to Toronto, and never returned to Fort William. McGill's subsequent career was extraordinary in its own right. She drafted the International Airworthiness Regulations for the International Civil Aviation Organization in 1946, the rules that govern how every commercial aircraft in the world is certified to fly. She served as a commissioner on the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada from 1967 to 1970, helping produce the landmark report that reshaped Canadian gender policy. She co-founded the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. She was named to the Order of Canada in 1971 and designated a National Historic Person in 2007. A Heritage Minute aired in 2020. A Royal Canadian Mint commemorative loonie was struck in 2023. 2 schools bear her name, one in Thunder Bay, one in Milton, Ontario. The 70-strong Royal Canadian Air Cadet Squadron was renamed in her honor in 2022. She died on the 4th of November, 1980, in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was 75. She'd walked on 2 canes since she was 24. She never stopped walking. The Helldiver line at Fort William ran from 1943 to 1945, producing 835 aircraft, roughly 12% of the world's total Helldiver output. Combined with the Hurricanes, Car Fort William built 2,286 combat aircraft during the Second World War. It was the largest single Canadian aircraft production facility of the conflict. When the war ended in August 1945, the layoffs came fast. 1,200 women were still working at Car when the Helldiver line shut down. All but 3 of them were laid off. The 3 who remained, their names unrecorded in the available sources, presumably held positions that couldn't be immediately filled by returning men. The other 1,200 walked out through the same gates they'd walked in through, carrying their tools and their lunch pails, and whatever else they'd accumulated over 2, 3, 4 years of building aircraft in Northern Ontario. They'd helped win a war. They'd earned industrial wages that had given them a taste of financial independence most of them had never known. Now the war was over. The men were coming home, and the plant on the Kaministiquia needed them for exactly nothing. The pattern was the same at every wartime plant in Canada. The women left. The men returned. The factories retooled or went dark. The question was whether Fort William would go dark again, the way it had in 1921, when the deer colonized the grounds and the building sat empty for 16 years. This time, the answer was different, not because the economics were better, but because someone had already made a deal. Chapter 6. Buses, Harvards, and the Second Life. The deal that saved Fort William from a second dormancy was signed in 1944, before the war was even over. Canadian Car and Foundry partnered with ACF Brill of Philadelphia, the successor to the J.G. Brill Company, the oldest and largest streetcar and bus manufacturer in the United States, in a licensing agreement that gave Fort William the exclusive Canadian rights to build buses, trolley coaches, and streetcars. It was a pivot that made intuitive sense. The plant's core competence was building large, heavy vehicles from steel and aluminum on a production line. An aircraft fuselage and a bus body shared more manufacturing DNA than their end products suggested. Both were stressed skin structures assembled from sheet metal over a structural frame, fitted out with electrical systems and interior components, and rolled off a line that demanded consistency and precision at volume. The first trolleybus prototype was completed in September 1946, barely a year after the last Helldiver had left the building. The first 10 production units went to the Kitchener-Waterloo Transit System in November 1946. The engineering team, depleted of McGill and Soulsby, but still carrying the institutional knowledge of wartime mass production, adapted quickly. They mounted the bus bodies on tubular supports on 2 parallel assembly lines, running down B Bay, the largest of the factory's assembly halls. 13 line stations handled the progression from bare frame to finished vehicle, using a modular construction system that built the front section, rear section, and major subassemblies separately before splicing them together on the main line. The system was efficient enough that Fort William became one of the more productive bus plants in North America. Not the largest, but unusually fast for its size. Over the next decade, CCF Brill buses and trolley coaches rolled out of the Kaministiquia plant and onto the streets of Canadian cities that most people today associate with cars, not transit. The T44 and T44A trolley buses, the T48 series, the TD43 and TD51 motor coaches, designations that mean nothing to anyone who wasn't a transit enthusiast, but that represented a complete fleet replacement for systems from Vancouver to Halifax. The Transit Museum Society in Vancouver still preserves at least 7 CCF-built buses, including 2 trolley coaches, silent electric vehicles that ran on overhead wires through neighborhoods where the houses were still heated with coal. Streetcars followed. Fort William built PCC-type streetcars under license for Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, and Regina. The PCC, President's Conference Committee car, a streamlined American design from the 1930s that became the global standard for modern streetcar operation, was the vehicle that kept Canadian cities connected to the idea of rail transit during the decades when most American cities were ripping up their tracks. CanCar didn't design them. They built them reliably and in volume and shipped them across the country. 2 orders went further. Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, Brazil, received PCC cars assembled at Fort William. It was a brief window of export ambition that closed quickly. The Brazilian market moved on, and CanCar never became a serious international competitor in transit. But for a few years in the early 1950s, streetcars built beside the Kaministiquia River were carrying passengers through the heat of a South American city, 9,000 kilometers away. The last gasp of aviation at Fort William came in 2 contracts that bridged the gap between the wartime aircraft factory and the peacetime transit plant. Between 1951 and 1955, CanCar assembled 555 North American Harvard Mark IV trainers, the final propeller-driven training aircraft of the NATO Air Training Plan, built for the RCAF, the United States Air Force, and the West German Luftwaffe, which was being reconstituted under NATO supervision a decade after the war that had destroyed it. The Harvard was a proven design, simple to build compared to a Hurricane, and the production run was essentially a government subsidy dressed in military camouflage, a way to keep the plant busy and the workforce employed while the transit business scaled up. In 1954 and 1955, a smaller run of 125 Beech Mentor T-34A primary trainers followed, again for military customers. After the Mentor, no complete aircraft was ever built at Fort William again. The plant that Elsie McGill had turned into the largest aircraft factory in wartime Canada became, permanently and irrevocably, a ground transportation manufacturer. The transition was quiet. There was no ceremony, no public announcement, no moment when someone shut off the aircraft assembly line for the last time. The jigs and fixtures were removed, the tooling was sold or scrapped, and the bays that had once held Hurricane fuselages in various stages of assembly were reconfigured for bus bodies and streetcar shells. The sky was no longer Fort William's business. The ground was. But the most important product of CanCar's post-war era wasn't something that ran on rails or roads. It ran on no road at all. Chapter 7. Tree Farmer Country. The articulated rubber-tired logging skidder was invented by a man named Dwight Garrett, working out of Enumclaw, Washington, a small town in the foothills of Mount Rainier, where the Pacific Northwest timber industry had been extracting old-growth Douglas fir since the 1880s. Garrett's insight was deceptively simple. Logging in the mid-20th century still relied heavily on crawler tractors, tracked machines that dragged felled trees out of the bush to a landing where they could be loaded onto trucks. Crawlers were powerful but slow, destructive to the ground they crossed, and limited by terrain. Garrett designed a machine that articulated in the middle, the front and rear halves pivoting independently around a central joint, rode on large rubber tires instead of tracks, and could navigate terrain that would stop a crawler dead. He called it the Tree Farmer. Canadian Car and Foundry began building the Tree Farmer under license at Fort William in the early 1960s. The precise date isn't pinned down in the public record, but operator memory and Garrett's own product timeline placed the start of Canadian production somewhere around 1960 to 1963, when CanCar was already operating as a subsidiary of AV Row Canada. The timing was perfect. Canada's boreal forest, the vast band of spruce, jack pine, and birch that stretches from Newfoundland to the Yukon, was the largest softwood resource on the continent, and the post-war construction boom was consuming lumber at a rate that demanded mechanized extraction on a scale the industry had never attempted. The pulp and paper mills of Northern Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia needed wood. The Tree Farmer was the machine that could get it out. The models built at Thunder Bay read like a parts catalog to anyone who hasn't spent time in the bush, but to the men who drove them, each designation carried specific meaning. The C4 was the entry-level machine, lighter, more maneuverable, suited to smaller timber. The C5 was the step up. The C5D was the workhorse, the machine that defined the brand, the one that veteran loggers still talk about 40 years later in equipment forums, with the quiet reverence that mechanics reserve for things that simply worked. The C6 and C6D were heavier, built for bigger wood and steeper ground. The C7 was the largest. The Garrett 22A was a later model that carried the Garrett name alongside the Car engineering. The color shifted in 1974, from the original orange and yellow livery to an iconic lime green that became as recognizable in the Canadian bush as the orange of a Husqvarna chainsaw or the yellow of a Caterpillar dozer. If you flew over a logging operation anywhere in the boreal forest from the mid-1970s to the late 1980s, the chances were better than even that the machine snaking between the stumps, dragging a hitch of spruce logs behind it, was lime green. It was a tree farmer. It was almost certainly built in Thunder Bay. The men who operated tree farmers worked in conditions that made the wartime aircraft factory look comfortable. A logging camp in northern Ontario in January meant temperatures that could drop to -40, the point where Celsius and Fahrenheit converge, and the distinction ceases to matter. The skidder cab, such as it was, offered minimal protection. Early models had no cab at all. The operator sat on an open platform, exposed to wind, snow, and the constant spray of bark and debris thrown up by the tires. Later models added an enclosed cab with a heater, but the heater fought a losing battle against the cold that seeped through every seal and joint. Hydraulic fluid thickened in the cold. Rubber hoses cracked. Diesel fuel gelled if it wasn't treated with anti-gel additive. And if the operator forgot, or if the supply ran out, the machine sat dead until the temperature climbed, or someone lit a fire under the fuel tank, which was exactly as dangerous as it sounds. The operators were, in large part, the sons and grandsons of the same Finnish, Ukrainian, and French-Canadian families who had built the Lakehead's economy. The Finnish connection was particularly strong. Finnish immigrants had been working the bush camps of northwestern Ontario since the 1890s, first as manual laborers in the River Drive era, when logs were floated downstream to the mills on the spring freshet, and then as machine operators when mechanization arrived. The Finnish Labor Temple at 314 Bay Street in Thunder Bay, built by volunteer Finnish labor in 1910, had served as the headquarters of the Canadian Industrial Workers of the World and the founding meeting place of the Social Democratic Party of Canada, the ancestor of the NDP. Finnish workers had brought with them a tradition of labor militancy forged in the 1918 Finnish Civil War and sharpened by the class conflicts of the Canadian bush. They organized. They struck. They formed the backbone of Lumber Workers' Industrial Union, Local 120, and the Communist Finnish Organization of Canada. 2,000 to 3,000 Finnish Canadians had left for Soviet Karelia in the 1920s and 1930s, drawn by the promise of a workers' state. Finnish Canadians also formed the Ilka Machine Gun Company of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion in the Spanish Civil War. The Finnish word for the quality that defined these people was sisu, a term that resists clean translation, but means something like stubborn endurance in the face of conditions that would break a sensible person. Sisu was why you got back on the skidder at -35 after the hydraulic line blew. Sisu was why you walked 4 kilometers through waist-deep snow to the road when the machine wouldn't start. Sisu was why Thunder Bay existed as an industrial city at all, because without a workforce willing to do brutal work in brutal conditions for wages that were decent but never luxurious, the plant on the Kaministikia would have stayed dormant after every contraction. The tree farmer earned its place in the Canadian bush because it was the right machine for the right landscape at the right moment. The boreal forest is not the Pacific Northwest. The trees are smaller. The terrain is flatter but wetter. The distances are immense, and the operating season is dictated by frost. Logging in the boreal runs primarily in winter, when the frozen ground can support heavy equipment without turning to swamp. A crawler tractor left ruts that didn't heal for years. A rubber-tired skidder left tracks that the spring thaw erased. The articulated steering allowed the machine to thread between standing timber on trails too narrow and too curved for a rigid frame tractor. And the speed, a tree farmer on a good trail could cover ground twice as fast as a crawler, which meant more wood moved per shift, which meant more revenue per machine, which meant that every logging contractor in the country who ran the numbers came to the same conclusion: buy the green machine. Hawker Siddeley Canada operated a dedicated tree farmer woodlands division at Thunder Bay through the 1970s, keeping the logging equipment business distinct from the transit manufacturing operations that occupied the rest of the plant. The two product lines shared a factory, a labor force, and a management structure, but they served entirely different customers. The transit side sold to government agencies in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and a handful of American cities, while the woodlands division sold to private sector logging contractors and pulp companies across the Boreal. It was an unusual combination. Most factories build one kind of thing. Thunder Bay built subway cars and logging skidders on the same site, sometimes in adjacent bays, staffed by workers who might rivet a streetcar body in the morning and weld a skidder frame in the afternoon. The combination worked because both products were, at their core, heavy steel and aluminum fabrication. Cut, bend, weld, assemble, paint, ship. The skills transferred. The workforce was versatile, and the dual product line offered something that a single product plant couldn't: insurance. When transit orders were lean, the tree farmer line kept workers employed. When the logging market softened, the subway cars filled the gap. It was an accidental resilience, not a strategic plan. But for 2 decades, it kept the Thunder Bay plant steadier than it had any right to be. Chapter 8. The Buy Level and the Billion-Dollar Order Book. By the mid-1970s, the Thunder Bay plant had evolved into something that no one in 1912 could have predicted, and no one in 1945 would have believed. A diversified heavy manufacturing facility that produced transit vehicles for 3 levels of Canadian government and logging equipment for the private sector, employed over 1,000 workers, and sat at the center of a web of supply relationships that reached from Northern Ontario's steel distributors to electronics firms in Southern Ontario and Quebec. The product that defined this era, the one that would outlast every other thing the plant ever built, was the bi-level commuter coach. The bi-level was designed at Hawker Siddeley Canada's Thunder Bay facility starting in the early 1970s for GO Transit, the Government of Ontario's commuter rail service connecting Toronto's suburbs to Union Station. The engineering problem was specific and elegant. How do you carry the maximum number of seated passengers on a rail vehicle constrained by the loading gauge of existing North American rail corridors? The answer was a double-deck coach with a depressed center aisle on the lower level and a raised upper deck accessed by stairs at each end, a design that packed roughly 50% more seats into the same vehicle length as a conventional single-level coach. The first bi-levels were delivered in 1976 and 1977, entering revenue service on the 13th of March, 1978. The design was good. It was better than good. It was a genuine Canadian innovation that solved a problem shared by every commuter rail system on the continent. GO Transit's bi-levels became the template for suburban rail across North America. The smooth ride, the high seating capacity, the air conditioning that actually worked, the wide windows that gave passengers on the upper deck a view of the suburbs scrolling past at track speed. It was a vehicle that made commuting, if not pleasant, at least tolerable. And every single one of them was built in Thunder Bay. 1,510 bi-level coaches delivered by the time the 21st century was well underway, with 65 more on order. Not a single bi-level was ever built anywhere else. The Kaministiquia plant owned that product line completely. The subway work was equally significant, if less visible to the general public. Hawker Siddeley had been building subway cars for the Toronto Transit Commission since the 1960s. The M1 cars for the Bloor-Danforth line, ordered in 1963, were the first. The H-series followed through the 1970s and into the 1980s. H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, each a refinement of the basic Toronto subway platform, each built at Thunder Bay and shipped by rail to Toronto for final testing and commissioning. In 1972, Hawker Siddeley delivered 46 PA3 cars for the PATH system, the Port Authority Trans-Hudson Rail Line connecting New Jersey to Manhattan. The MBTA in Boston ordered 70 Blue Line cars in the late 1970s and 120 Orange Line cars in 1980 and 1981. American transit agencies were buying Canadian-built rolling stock, manufactured in a northern Ontario city most of them couldn't have found on a map. The streetcar business continued in parallel. The Government of Ontario, through its newly created Urban Transportation Development Corporation, forced the TTC in August 1973 to purchase Canadian light rail vehicles, the CLRVs that would become the iconic red and cream streetcars of late 20th century Toronto. The design was licensed from the Swiss firm SIG, which built the first 6 cars, numbered 4000 through 4005. The remaining 190 vehicles, numbers 4010 through 4199, were subcontracted to Hawker Siddeley's CC&F plant in Thunder Bay and delivered between 1979 and 1981. Articulated light rail vehicles, the longer ALRVs, followed, 52 ordered by the TTC in February 1984. The scale of the operation was substantial. During a good year in the late 1970s or early 1980s, the Thunder Bay plant might have subway cars in various stages of assembly in one bay, streetcar bodies being welded in another, bi-level coaches progressing through their own dedicated line, and tree farmer skidders taking shape in the Woodlands Division section of the complex. 4 distinct product lines, 4 distinct customer bases, 1 workforce, drawing on skills that had been accumulating at the Lakehead since the first boxcars rolled out in 1914. 65 years of continuous, evolving heavy manufacturing expertise. The Finnish labor temple community, the Ukrainian clubs, the Italian social societies, the legions and hockey rinks, and Tim Hortons of Thunder Bay. All of it ran, in one way or another, on the paychecks that came out of the plant. A family with one parent at CanCar and one at the grain elevators could buy a house on a quiet street south of the inner city, put the kids through school, outfit them for hockey, and spend 2 weeks every summer at a cottage on one of the lakes within a few hours' drive. It wasn't luxury, it was security, the particular, irreplaceable Canadian version of working-class stability that depended on a steady industrial employer in a town where the alternatives were limited. The union, Unifor Local 1075 and its predecessors, was the institutional counterweight to management. The relationship was adversarial in the traditional Canadian sense. Hard bargaining, occasional grievances, the constant tension between production targets and working conditions, but undergirded by a shared understanding that the plant's survival was in everyone's interest. The stewards knew the contract. The foreman knew the stewards knew the contract. And both sides knew that Thunder Bay wasn't Toronto or Hamilton. There was no other plant down the road if this one closed. That mutual vulnerability created a labor management dynamic that was, by Canadian industrial standards, relatively stable. Not harmonious, stable. The strikes would come later. The immigrant dimension ran deep. By the 1970s and 1980s, the original Finnish and Ukrainian communities had been joined by Italian families, Portuguese workers, and smaller numbers from other European and, increasingly, non-European backgrounds. The factory floor was multilingual in the way that Canadian heavy industry had always been multilingual. English was the common language of the line, but the break-room conversations shifted between Finnish and Italian and Ukrainian, and the cultural institutions of each community, the churches, the halls, the sports clubs, anchored a social life that revolved around the plant's shift schedule. When the 7 to 3 shift let out, the parking lot emptied in a pattern that mapped almost perfectly onto the ethnic geography of the city. Finnish families heading north toward the old neighborhoods near the Labor Temple. Italian families heading south toward the newer subdivisions. Everyone converging again at the same gate the next morning. Women had returned to the plant in smaller numbers after the war, concentrated in clerical, electrical, and quality control roles, rather than the welding and riveting positions they'd held during the hurricane and helldiver years. The wartime Rosies were aging. Their daughters and granddaughters, for the most part, found work elsewhere, in healthcare, education, retail, the expanding service economy that was replacing manufacturing across Canada. The shop floor remained overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly white, and overwhelmingly defined by the physical demands of heavy fabrication. Lifting, welding, grinding, painting, working in steel-toed boots on concrete floors, in a building where the temperature swung between the heat of the welding bay and the cold that leaked through the loading dock doors, every time a finished vehicle was moved out for shipping. Chapter 9. The Summit. There was a moment, difficult to date precisely, easier to feel, when the Thunder Bay plant reached its high water mark. It wasn't a single day. It was a period, roughly spanning the late 1970s through the mid-1980s, when the order book was full, the product lines were diversified, the workforce was stable, and the future looked, if not guaranteed, at least plausible. The buy level was selling. Go Transit's system was expanding, and every new train set meant more coaches from Thunder Bay. The subway orders kept coming. The H-Series for the TTC, the American contracts for PATH, the MBTA. The CLRVs were being delivered to Toronto, and the ALRVs were on order. The Tree Farmer line was thriving. The C5D was the dominant skidder in the Canadian Boreal, and the Woodlands division was running at capacity. Employment at the plant sat comfortably above 1,000. In 1983, the institutional structure shifted in a way that seemed at the time like a natural evolution. Hawker Siddeley sold a portion of its Thunder Bay plant to the Urban Transportation Development Corporation, creating a jointly owned entity called Car Rail. The Car name, which had faded from the corporate hierarchy after the Hawker Siddeley absorption in 1962, was briefly revived in a new configuration. UTDC brought government backing and transit contracts, including the TTC's order for 126 H6 subway cars in December 1983. Hawker Siddeley brought the plant, the workforce, and the manufacturing expertise. The joint venture was supposed to combine public sector stability with private sector efficiency. The order book told a story of a plant that had found its niche: subway cars for the TTC, streetcars for the TTC, bi-level coaches for Go Transit, skidders for the logging industry, military vehicles, the M35 2.5-ton MLVW truck, and the larger Steyr-derived Percheron HLVW, both built under UTDC-era contracts for the Canadian Forces. The product range was extraordinary for a single plant. Thunder Bay was building machines that went underground in Toronto, machines that carried commuters along the Lakeshore Corridor, machines that hauled spruce logs out of the bush north of Kapuskasing, and machines that carried soldiers and ammunition for the Canadian military. The versatility was the plant's armor, or so it seemed. What nobody on the shop floor could see from the vantage point of 1984 or 1985 was the gathering convergence of forces that would strip away that armor, one layer at a time. The tree farmer would go first, then the military work, then the transit business would be concentrated, consolidated, and handed to an owner whose priorities lay elsewhere. The peak was real. The pride was earned. A worker standing on the floor of B Bay in 1985, watching a TTC subway car take shape at one end, while a lime green skidder was being painted at the other, could reasonably believe that this plant, this peculiar, versatile, northern factory on the Kaministikia, had figured out something that most Canadian industrial facilities hadn't: how to survive by being too useful to too many customers to be shut down. That belief would be tested. Tested by a British conglomerate that saw the Lakehead as one line item on a global balance sheet. Tested by a Quebec engineering firm that collapsed under its own ambitions. Tested by a Montreal-based transportation giant that bought the plant, rode it hard, and sold it to the French. Tested by the fundamental structural reality that had defined this place since 1909, that every decision about Thunder Bay's industrial future would be made by someone who didn't live there. The deer had colonized the grounds once before, in the long silence between 1921 and 1937. What was coming wasn't silence, not exactly. It was something slower, a gradual thinning, a reduction by degrees. One product line lost, then another. The workforce halved, then halved again. The plant shrinking inside its own footprint, like a body losing weight it couldn't afford to lose, until what remained was a fraction of what had been. Still alive, still producing, but so diminished that the survival itself became the story. The summit in the mid-1980s was the last time the plant would be full. Not full of deer, full of work. Chapter 10. The British Ledger. The seeds of what happened to the Thunder Bay plant were sown not in Thunder Bay, but in England, and they were sown a generation before the consequences arrived on the shop floor. On the 8th of June, 1955, Avro Canada, Avro Canada, the aerospace company that had designed the CF-100 Canuck jet interceptor and was about to begin work on the legendary Avro Aero, made a formal offer to purchase Canadian Car and Foundry. The offer was accepted the same day. The speed of the transaction tells you something about the balance of power. CCNF's board didn't negotiate, didn't seek competing bids, didn't consult the workforce or the communities whose livelihoods depended on the factories. They said yes the day they were asked, and by 1957, the deal was closed. CanCar became a subsidiary of Avro Canada. Avro Canada was itself a wholly owned subsidiary of the Hawker Siddeley Group, the British aerospace and industrial conglomerate headquartered in London. The chain of ownership now ran from the shop floor in Fort William, through the Avro offices in Malton, Ontario, through the Canadian Holding Company, and across the Atlantic to a British boardroom. The men who welded skidder frames and riveted subway car bodies in Northern Ontario were now, at 3 removes, employees of a London-based multinational that also manufactured jet engines in Coventry, built aircraft at Kingston upon Thames, and operated de Havilland facilities on 4 continents. Fort William was a line item. It had always been a line item. Aitken's merger had made it one in 1909, but now the ledger was kept in England. The Aero cancellation changed everything and nothing. On the 20th of February, 1959, a day that Canadian aviation historians call Black Friday, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker announced that the Avro Aero program was cancelled. 14,000 Avro Canada employees were laid off, most of them at the Malton plant near Toronto. The Aero, the most advanced interceptor aircraft in the world at the time of its cancellation, was ordered destroyed. Airframes, jigs, tooling, blueprints, all of it cut up or burned in one of the most controversial decisions in Canadian industrial history. The engineering brain trust that had designed the Aero scattered, many to NASA, where they contributed to the Apollo program, carrying Canadian aerospace knowledge into American hands. For Fort William, the Aero cancellation was devastating in its indirect effects, but not in its immediate ones. The Thunder Bay plant didn't build the Aero, that was Malton's work. But the cancellation killed Avro Canada as a corporate entity. Avro was wound up. Its remaining assets, including Canadian Car and Foundry, were reorganized in 1962 into a new entity, Hawker Siddeley Canada Limited, headquartered in Mississauga. The historic Canadian Car and Foundry name was retained as a brand. It appeared on some vehicles and in some contracts for years afterward, but it disappeared from the corporate hierarchy. The company that Nathaniel Curry had fronted and Max Aitken had financed was now a division of a division, its identity absorbed into a British-controlled Canadian subsidiary that answered to London. What mattered for the workers at the Lakehead wasn't the name on the letterhead. What mattered was who made decisions and where they sat when they made them. Under the old CCNF structure, decisions had been made in Montreal, distant enough, but at least on the same continent, in the same time zone, subject to the same weather and the same federal government. Under Hawker Siddeley, the ultimate authority sat in London. The Canadian management in Mississauga had operational control, but strategic decisions, what to invest in, what to divest, which plants to expand, and which to rationalize, were shaped by the priorities of a global conglomerate whose Canadian rail operations were one portfolio among many. The rationalization began almost immediately. Hawker Siddeley's Canadian holdings were vast and sprawling, inherited from the Avro era and from CCNF's own history of vertical integration. Halifax Shipyards, once a crown jewel of maritime heavy industry, was eventually sold to Irving Shipbuilding, the New Brunswick conglomerate that would decades later win the federal combat shipbuilding contract. The original Rhodes Curry works in Amherst, Nova Scotia, Nathaniel Curry's birthplace as an industrialist, the plant where the whole story had started in 1877, had already closed in 1931, a casualty of the same merger that was supposed to make it more competitive. DOSCO, the Dominion Steel and Coal Corporation that Hawker Siddeley had inherited, was forced to close its Cape Breton coal mines and steel mills. The federal and Nova Scotia governments eventually expropriated what remained, creating the Cape Breton Development Corporation and the Sydney Steel Corporation, Cisco, which would spend the next 4 decades consuming public money in a doomed effort to keep Cape Breton's industrial heart beating. The Sydney tar ponds, the toxic legacy of a century of coke oven operations, became one of the worst environmental contamination sites in Canada. Every one of those closures, sales, and rationalizations was decided in an office that was not in the community where the work was done. Halifax didn't decide to lose its shipyard. Amherst didn't decide to lose its car works. Cape Breton didn't decide to lose its steel. London decided. Mississauga decided. And the people who lived with the consequences learned something that Thunder Bay would learn in its turn. When you don't own the factory, you don't control the factory. And when you don't control the factory, you're one boardroom calculation away from losing it. Thunder Bay survived the Hawker Siddeley rationalization because it was still useful. The transit orders were flowing. The tree farmer was selling. The bi-level was becoming a signature product. The plant on the Kaministikia wasn't the most profitable asset in the Hawker Siddeley portfolio, but it was productive, versatile, and, crucially, the beneficiary of Canadian content procurement rules that made it politically difficult to close. Federal and provincial governments that bought transit vehicles wanted them built in Canada. Thunder Bay was where they were built. That dependency on political will was both a lifeline and a leash. It meant the plant survived. It also meant the plant survived at the pleasure of governments and parent companies whose calculations could change overnight. The first product line to go was the one that had nothing to do with politics. Chapter 11. The Green Machine Goes South. In 1990, Hawker Siddeley Canada sold the entire tree farmer skidder division to Franklin Equipment Company of Franklin, Virginia. The sale was quiet. There was no public outcry, no parliamentary debate, no CBC investigative segment. A British-controlled Canadian subsidiary sold a logging equipment product line to an American company, and the transaction barely registered outside the communities directly affected. But for the workers who had built tree farmers at Thunder Bay, and for the loggers across the Boreal who had depended on the green machines for a quarter century, the sale was the end of something that couldn't be replaced. The economics, from London's perspective, were straightforward. The tree farmer was a niche product in a cyclical industry. The logging market fluctuated with commodity prices, housing starts, and the seasonal rhythm of the Boreal, busy in winter, quiet in spring and summer. The margins were thin compared to transit, where government contracts came with guaranteed volumes and indexed pricing. The Woodlands division at Thunder Bay employed fewer workers than the transit side, generated less revenue, and served a customer base, private sector logging contractors, that had no political leverage. When Hawker Siddeley's management ran the numbers, the tree farmer division looked like what a financial analyst would call a non-core asset. The human translation of non-core asset is something we can sell without anyone who matters complaining. Franklin Equipment took the brand, the tooling, the intellectual property, and the manufacturing rights. Production had already been shifting toward a plant in Talladega, Alabama. Cheaper labor, lower heating bills, closer to the southern U.S. timber market. Franklin closed the Talladega plant in 1991, consolidated Tree Farmer alongside its own Franklin brand skidder line, and operated out of Franklin, Virginia, until the company went out of business on the 1st of January 2009. The doors closed for good in 2010. The Tree Farmer brand died in a small Virginia town, 800 kilometers from the nearest Boreal spruce stand, owned by a company that had never heard the word Sisu. What survived was a used equipment and parts market that, decades later, remains remarkably vibrant. Loggers across northern Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia still run C5Ds and C6Ds that were built in Thunder Bay in the 1970s and 1980s. The machines are rebuilt, rehydraulicked, fitted with new cabs and modern electronics, and sent back into the bush. The parts are scavenged, fabricated, or machined by small shops that specialize in keeping the green machines running. Equipment forums carry threads where operators compare notes on C5D maintenance with the affection and technical precision that vintage car enthusiasts bring to a 1967 Mustang. The machines were built to last, and they have lasted, longer, in many cases, than the company that built them. For the Thunder Bay plant, the loss of the tree farmer line meant the loss of the accidental insurance policy that had kept the workforce stable through lean transit years. The dual product resilience that had defined the plant since the 1960s was gone. From 1990 onward, Thunder Bay was a single product facility: transit, subway cars, streetcars, commuter coaches. The plant's survival now depended entirely on government transit procurement, which meant it depended on political cycles, budget votes, and the willingness of federal and provincial governments to enforce Canadian content rules in a world that was moving rapidly toward free trade and open procurement. That dependency might have been manageable if the ownership had been stable, but stability was the one thing Thunder Bay would not get. Chapter 12. Musical chairs. The sequence of ownership changes that swept through the Thunder Bay plant between 1986 and 1992 reads like a corporate shell game, and the workers on the floor experienced it as exactly that: a game played above their heads, with their livelihoods as the stakes, by players who arrived with promises and departed with whatever they could carry. In 1986, the Government of Ontario privatized UTDC, the Urban Transportation Development Corporation, the Crown agency that had been the Thunder Bay plant's transit contracting partner since the early 1970s, by selling it to Lavalin of Quebec. Lavalin was one of the two great Quebec engineering firms, alongside SNC. The acquisition made a certain strategic sense. Lavalin gained a transit manufacturing capability, and UTDC gained access to private capital and international markets. The workers at Thunder Bay, who had been building UTDC contracted vehicles alongside Hawker Siddeley products, now found themselves working for a Montreal-based engineering firm whose core business was construction and consulting, not manufacturing. Bernard Lamar, Lavalin's chairman and the architect of the company's aggressive expansion, had built the firm through a series of acquisitions and international contracts that stretched across the developing world. Hydroelectric projects in Africa, infrastructure contracts in the Middle East, engineering mandates in Southeast Asia. The ambition was enormous. The financial discipline was not. Lavalin's expansion was fueled by debt, and by the late 1980s, the debt was fueled by increasingly speculative projects whose returns were uncertain and whose risks were inadequately hedged. In 1991, Lavalin collapsed. The firm's financial implosion, driven by losses on real estate investments and international contracts that had gone bad, was one of the most spectacular corporate failures in Quebec history. The subsequent merger with SNC, creating SNC Lavalin, a company that would itself become synonymous with scandal decades later, salvaged the engineering business, but left the manufacturing assets in limbo. UTDC, including its share of the Thunder Bay plant, reverted to the Government of Ontario. The provincial government, which had created UTDC in the first place and had already sold it once, now had it back. An unwanted return, like a gift that keeps arriving at the door. The Ontario government's solution was to sell again, this time to Bombardier. Bombardier Inc., the Valcourt, Quebec, snowmobile manufacturer that had reinvented itself as a global transportation company, acquired UTDC and the associated rail manufacturing assets from the Ontario government in February 1992. The transaction included the Thunder Bay plant. The purchase price was never publicly disclosed in clean form, because the deal was structured as an asset transfer rather than a public share transaction, and because the Thunder Bay plant arrived as part of a package that included UTDC's technology portfolio, its contracts, and the rail manufacturing assets that Lavalin had earlier purchased from Hawker Siddeley Canada. What the workers at Thunder Bay knew was that they had, in the space of 6 years, worked for Hawker Siddeley, then jointly for Hawker Siddeley and UTDC under the Cancar rail banner, then for Lavalin, then briefly for the Ontario government again, and now for Bombardier. 5 masters in 6 years. Each one had arrived with a press release about commitment to the lakehead. Each one had eventually handed them to the next. Laurent Baudouin, Bombardier's president from 1966 and CEO from 1979 to 1999, was the son-in-law of founder J. Armand Bombardier, the Valcourt mechanic who had invented the modern snowmobile. Baudouin had transformed the family business into a multinational through a series of acquisitions that echoed, in their ambition, if not their financing, the merger mania of Max Aitken's era. Bombardier had purchased Lohner Rotax in Austria in 1970, gaining a European manufacturing foothold. In 1986, Bombardier acquired Canadair from the federal government, entering aerospace. Short Brothers in Belfast followed, then de Havilland Canada, then Learjet. The rail division, anchored by the Thunder Bay and La Pocatière plants, was one arm of a conglomerate that also built business jets, regional aircraft, and snowmobiles. The scale was impressive. The strategic coherence was debatable. Bombardier under Baudouin was a company that believed in growth through acquisition, financed by the confidence of capital markets and the support of the Quebec and federal governments. Every acquisition added capacity, capability, and debt. The aerospace side, in particular, consumed capital at a rate that would eventually overwhelm the company. The C-Series regional jet program, later sold to Airbus and renamed the A220, would bleed billions before it was finally taken off Bombardier's books. But in 1992, those consequences were a generation away. What mattered for Thunder Bay was that the plant had, for the first time since the Aitken merger, an owner whose core business was transportation manufacturing. Bombardier knew how to build trains. Bombardier had contracts. Bombardier had government relationships. Bombardier was Canadian. The catch, there is always a catch, was that Bombardier's headquarters were in Montreal. Decisions were made in Montreal. Capital was allocated in Montreal. And the Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, the province's pension fund manager, one of the largest institutional investors in Canada, held a growing stake in Bombardier's operations. Thunder Bay was, once again, a branch plant. A productive branch plant. A necessary branch plant. But a branch plant nonetheless, dependent on orders that were won and allocated by people who lived 1,000 kilometers away, and whose political, financial, and strategic interests were centered on Quebec. Chapter 13. The Toronto Rockets and the halving Bombardier's Thunder Bay era began with promise and ended with a workforce that had been halved again, and left waiting for a contract that might or might not arrive. The peak came first. Under Bombardier, the Thunder Bay plant focused almost entirely on transit, subway cars, streetcars, and commuter coaches for Canadian and American clients. The product list was impressive. Toronto Rocket subway trains for the TTC, the most significant order in the plant's history. 82 train sets totaling 480 cars, delivered through April 2017. Additional H6 and T1 subway cars. Flexity Outlook streetcars for the TTC. Ongoing bi-level commuter coach deliveries for Joe Transit. Commuter coaches for American clients including Tri-Rail in South Florida, West Coast Express in Vancouver, Sounder in Seattle, ACE in Stockton, TRE in Dallas, Metrolink and Coaster and Caltrain and NCTD in California, and AMT, later EXO, in Montreal. The order book, on paper, looked deep. Employment peaked at roughly 1,300 in 2017, the year the centennial of the Fort William plant was marked with a modest ceremony. Raymond Bachant, Bombardier Transportation's North America president, offered a quote that captured the moment's optimism and its irony in a single breath. "It's great we're back to 1,300 employees in Thunder Bay. The last level of high employment was around the time this plant was producing the Hurricane aircraft." He was right. 1,300 was the highest since the war, and it was a fraction of the wartime peak of 5,000 to 7,000. The arithmetic of industrial decline is always denominated in fractions. The 2014 strike interrupted the Bombardier era like a crack in a windshield, small at the point of impact, spreading outward. 900 members of Unifor Local 1075, led by President Dominic Pasqualino, walked off the job on the 14th of July 2014. Bombardier had demanded concessions on pensions and retiree benefits. The membership wasn't having it. The strike lasted 9 weeks, the only major post-war labor stoppage in the plant's history. It was bitter in the way that strikes in single-employer towns are always bitter. The workers knew they had no other plant to go to, and the company knew it too. The Ontario Ministry of Labour administered 2 successive votes on Bombardier's last offer. The first was rejected 80%. The second, 81.5%, 612 against 139 for. The membership was not ambiguous. They would rather stand on the picket line through a Northern Ontario summer. And the Northern Ontario summer turned, as it always does, toward an early autumn, than accept what Bombardier was offering. The tentative settlement came on the 12th of September, 2014. First-year wage freeze, 10 cents per hour raise in years 2 and 3, pension structure preserved. It was a deal that both sides could characterize as a partial victory, which meant, in the blunt calculus of labor relations, that nobody had won. The strike delayed delivery of the Flexity Outlook streetcars and forced a delegation of Bombardier workers to make the trip to Toronto City Hall in August 2014 to explain, in person, why the new streetcars were late. It was a humiliation. Workers who built the vehicles being asked to apologize for a delay caused by a labor dispute triggered by the company's own demands. The real blow came in 2019. As the Toronto rocket order wound down, the last of the 480 cars delivered, the assembly bay emptying, the jigs being stored, Bombardier announced layoffs of approximately 550 workers. The order book was thinning. The next major contract hadn't materialized. Pasqualino, still leading Local 1075, told reporters, "The plant was halved, and now we're being almost halved again." The mathematics were stark, from 1,300 at the Centennial to roughly 600 in the space of 2 years. Then COVID arrived. The pandemic's effect on the Thunder Bay plant was paradoxical. A brief ventilator manufacturing contract provided a flicker of wartime echo. The factory that had built hurricanes was now building medical equipment in a national emergency. But the underlying trajectory was unchanged. 200 more workers were laid off in October 2020 and April 2021. By April 2021, employment at the plant stood at 270, down from 1,100 the previous year, down from 1,300 4 years before that, down from 5,000 to 7,000 during the war. 270 people, in a complex built for thousands, doing work that was real and necessary, but that occupied a fraction of the floor space and consumed a fraction of the energy and made a fraction of the noise. The Bombardier Labor Adjustment Center, a federally funded program that helped laid-off workers with retraining and job placement, closed at the same time. The Ontario government declined to provide further funding. The workers who'd been laid off were on their own. Chapter 14. The French Tricolor and the Tariff War. On the 29th of January 2021, Bombardier Transportation, the rail division that included the Thunder Bay plant, the La Pocatière facility in Quebec, and manufacturing sites across Europe and Asia, was sold to Alstom, the French rail giant. The transaction had been announced in February 2020 and renegotiated through the summer as COVID-era uncertainty compressed the price. The SPA enterprise value was $8.4 billion, approximately 7.15 billion euros. The reference price at closing was 5.5 billion euros, the bottom of a renegotiated range. Net proceeds to Bombardier Inc., after contractual adjustments worth 1.1 billion euros, were 4.4 billion euros. The Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, which had taken a 30% stake in Bombardier Transportation in 2015 for $1.5 billion, exited via the Alstom transaction. For the workers at Thunder Bay, the sale meant another name on the gate, another corporate logo on the letterhead, another set of executives in another distant city, this time Paris, making decisions about a factory they'd likely never visited. Thunder Bay became one of 3 Alstom plants in Ontario, alongside Brampton and Kingston, and one of 5 Alstom sites in Canada, with La Pocatière and Saint-Bruno de Montarville in Quebec completing the roster. The ownership chain now ran Aitken's 1909 merger to A.V. Rowe Canada in 1957, to Hawker Siddeley Canada in 1962, to Cancar Rail and UTDC in 1983, to Lavalin in 1986, to the Ontario government in 1991, to Bombardier in 1992, to Alstom in 2021. 8 owners in 112 years. London, Mississauga, Kingston, Montreal, Quebec City, Toronto, Montreal again, Paris. Not one of them Thunder Bay. The layoffs continued under Alstom with the mechanical regularity of a machine that nobody had figured out how to stop. 300 of 400 workers were laid off temporarily starting the 18th of March, 2022. Another round of approximately 200 followed in mid-May 2024, as the Toronto Flexity streetcar contract wound down. The pattern was always the same. A contract would end, the next one wouldn't be ready, and the workforce would be cut to a skeleton crew that maintained the buildings and waited. The way that skeleton crew had waited from 1921 to 1937. The way the deer had waited on the overgrown grounds. The Thunder Bay plant in 2024 looked, from certain angles, like an institution in its final decline. 270 workers where there had once been thousands. A floor space designed for wartime aircraft production occupied by a fraction of its capacity. An order book measured in dozens of vehicles rather than hundreds. The bi-level refurbishment contracts kept some workers busy. The promise of future streetcar orders sustained the union's hope. But the structural vulnerability was unchanged, and by now, familiar. The plant survived at the pleasure of transit procurement decisions made in Toronto, Ottawa, and now Paris. When those decisions produced orders, Thunder Bay worked. When they didn't, Thunder Bay waited. Then, in August 2025, the world shifted. The Trump-era tariff war, the escalating cycle of American import duties and retaliatory measures that had been reshaping North American trade since 2018, created a political environment in Ontario and Ottawa that hadn't existed since the national policy tariffs of 1879. The Ford government in Ontario, facing the threat of American tariffs on Canadian-manufactured goods, adopted a Buy Ontario procurement stance that explicitly prioritized domestic manufacturing. Federal policy aligned. The competitive RFP process that would normally have governed a major transit vehicle procurement was cancelled. On the 15th of August, 2025, Ontario Transportation Minister Prabmeet Sarkaria, Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow, and federal officials announced a sole-source contract worth 2.3 billion Canadian dollars, awarded to Alstom for 76 car subway train sets, 55 to replace the TTC's aging Line 2 fleet, and 15 for the Yonge North and Scarborough subway extensions, with options for up to 150 additional sets. Canadian content was set at 55%. Unifor Local 1075, now led by President Justin Roberts, who had succeeded Dominic Pasqualino, called it a made-in-Canada solution, a model for all sectors. On the 15th of January 2026, the funding was confirmed. The federal government committed $950 million, $950.9 million to be precise, per Ottawa's release. The Ontario government matched with its own $950 million. The City of Toronto added $776 million. The money was real. The contract was signed. Per the provincial release, the deal supported 240 manufacturing jobs at Alstom in Thunder Bay, 30 at Kingston, and 15 in Toronto. 285 direct Alstom positions over a 7 to 10-year span. Alstom's own communications projected up to 945 jobs across the full program supply chain. In parallel, a commitment of roughly $500 million to refurbish 181 GO Transit bi-level coaches at Thunder Bay was announced in early 2025. 240 jobs. Not 1,300. Not 5,000. Not 7,000. 240. Sustained over a decade by a sole-source contract that existed because of a tariff war that might end. Funded by 3 levels of government whose political complexions could change at the next election. The rescue was real. The rescue was also precarious. And the workers who stood at the gates of the Alstom plant, the same gates, on the same bank of the Kaministiquia, where Mayor Murphy had written his desperate letter to Ottawa in 1919, knew both of those things simultaneously. Chapter 15. What's left? The Canadian Car and Foundry plant was designated a National Historic Site on the 12th of January 2010. Recognition that came decades after the name had disappeared from the corporate hierarchy. A heritage plaque on a building owned by a company that no longer bore any connection to the men who'd laid the foundations in 1912. Elsie McGill was designated a National Historic Person in 2007. Her face appeared on a Canada Post stamp in 2019. A Heritage Minute aired in 2020. A commemorative loonie was struck by the Royal Canadian Mint in 2023. Two schools bear her name: École Elsie McGill Public School in Thunder Bay, which opened in 2020, and Elsie McGill Secondary School in Milton, Ontario, which followed in 2021. The 70-strong Royal Canadian Air Cadet Squadron was renamed in her honor in 2022. She is, in death, more famous than she was in life. The Queen of the Hurricanes frozen in bronze and silver. Her two canes polished out of the image. Her stubbornness canonized as inspiration. The Finnish Labor Temple at 314 Bay Street, the building that volunteer Finnish laborers had raised in 1910, that had housed the IWW headquarters, and the founding meeting of the NDP's ancestor party, that had anchored a century of radical working-class culture at the Lakehead, burned on the 22nd of December, 2021. The fire gutted the interior. The community launched a rebuilding campaign. The walls still stand, waiting for the money and the will to fill them again. Thunder Bay in 2026 is a city that has learned to live with loss the way a body learns to live with a chronic condition. Not cured, not healed, just adjusted. The grain elevators on the harbor, once the largest in the world, stand mostly decommissioned. Concrete monuments to a wheat economy that moved its logistics elsewhere. The Thunder Bay Pulp and Paper Newsprint Mill announced the closure of its newsprint line in January 2026, shedding 150 jobs. CEO Norm Bush cited a North American newsprint demand drop of 40% since 2022 and 18% in 2025 alone. The mill continues as a single-line softwood craft operation, a fraction of what it was. The Terrace Bay Pulp Mill, 220 kilometers east, was idled indefinitely in January 2024 under AV Group and Aditya Birla, putting 400 workers off the job. Sawmills across northwestern Ontario, Domtar's Ignis Mill, Interfor's Ear Falls, have idled or closed. The forestry economy that once sustained dozens of communities across the northern boreal is contracting, and the communities are contracting with it. What remains in Thunder Bay is gold mining, buoyed by commodity prices that won't last forever. 3 early-stage lithium projects: Avalon Advanced Materials, Frontier Lithium, Green Technology Metals, with refinery sites under study on the Thunder Bay waterfront, offering the possibility of a battery materials future that hasn't arrived yet and might not. Lakehead University, the regional hospital, healthcare and education, the universal fallback of Canadian cities that have lost their industrial anchor. And the Alstom plant on the Kaministiquia, with its $2.3 billion contract and its 240 jobs, and its 7 to 10-year window of certainty. Signal 49 Research projected Thunder Bay's citywide employment at an all-time record of 66,800 in 2025, a number that sounds triumphant until you learn that the forecast warned of a 2026 fallback and that the city's population has been essentially flat for half a century. Thunder Bay peaked at roughly 121,000 in the late 1970s, declined into the 100,000 to 108,000 range through the 1990s and 2010s as the industrial base eroded, and sits at approximately 108,000 in the 2021 census. The census metropolitan area is roughly 123,000. Comparable Canadian cities have doubled in the same period. A static population is the demographic signature of deindustrialization. Not a collapse, not a catastrophe, just a long, slow failure to grow while the rest of the country moves on. The plant itself still occupies most of the same footprint it did when the first boxcars rolled out in 1914. The barrel-roofed assembly bays, The machine shops, the rail-served loading docks. They're older, patched, modified 100 times over, but structurally recognizable. The Communistica flows past the same way it always has, brown with tannins from the boreal upstream, cold even in August, frozen solid by December. Mount McKay rises to the south, flat-topped and immovable, the sacred mesa of the Fort William First Nation, unchanged since the first hurricane climbed past its summit in January 1940. The geography doesn't care about ownership chains. The river runs regardless of who signs the paychecks. There is, for the first time in a generation, new work coming. The TTC Line 2 subway cars will be assembled in the same building where hurricanes were once riveted, where tree farmers were painted lime green, where bi-level coaches were fitted out for the morning commute from Pickering to Union Station. The contract is real. The money is committed. 240 workers will walk through those gates for the next decade, if everything holds, if the tariff war persists, if the political will sustains, if Alstom's Paris headquarters doesn't run the numbers and find a cheaper option somewhere else. If. That word has followed this plant for 113 years. If the railways keep ordering, if the war keeps needing aircraft, if the government keeps buying transit, if the owner keeps investing, if the contract comes through. The Communistica plant has survived every if so far, not through one catastrophe averted, but through a long, unbroken chain of rescues, each one arriving just late enough to thin the workforce and just early enough to keep the doors open. The deer colonized the grounds in 1921 and stayed until 1937. They haven't come back. But every time the order book thins and the layoff notices go out, and the parking lot empties down to a few dozen cars where there were once 1,000, someone in Thunder Bay remembers that story. The deer came once. What keeps them from coming again is a sole source contract and a tariff war, and the stubborn fact that somebody, somewhere, still needs subway trains built in Canada. The workers who walk through those gates know this. They've always known it. Their fathers knew it, and their grandfathers knew it. The Finns who poured the first castings, the women who riveted the hurricanes, the operators who drove the green machines into the bush at -35, the men and women who welded bi-level coaches and subway cars through decades of ownership changes that arrived like weather from somewhere else, without asking permission. The Communistica keeps running. The plant keeps standing. The work continues, smaller, quieter, leaner than anyone in 1943 or 1985 could have imagined. Not through one triumph, through a long, stubborn refusal to go dark. The silence hasn't come yet. And Thunder Bay, hard, cold, proud, Finnish stubborn, impossibly far from everywhere the decisions are made, plans to keep it that way for as long as anyone will let them.